Okay guys, so I think this is the last video for this PowerPoint. Hopefully they've been helpful. And I forgot to mention on that last video that we have not talked about positive and negative blood typing, but the simulation that you guys are going to do this week will go over all that. So pay close attention to that. All right, final topic is what is the difference between autosomal and sex chromosomes? You guys have already looked at this, but it's not 100% intuitive. Especially when we get to inheritance. So real quick, I threw this slide in to help you. And essentially, if you look at this, this is a set of human chromosomes. And chromosomes 1 through 22 are autosomal chromosomes, meaning that they are non-sex chromosomes in the sense that they do not code for the sex of the offspring. Set 23 codes for the offspring's sex, which is why they're called sex chromosomes. They also have some other traits on them that are not linked to sex. Some are essential to life. And the question I always ask you guys is which one of these chromosomes has genes that are essential to life? One of them does, and one of them doesn't. And think really hard about this one. I'm not going to answer the question, but think about it. Okay, so autosomal chromosomes. If I say a gene or a disorder is found on autosomal chromosome number 5, that means it's found on a non-sex chromosome, somewhere on this chromosome right here, chromosome number 5. So when we say an autosomal gene, if it has a loci on an autosome, that means, like I just said, it is not on a sex chromosome. It's on chromosomes 1 through 22. So we looked at this a little bit, and you guys started to maybe think about this stuff when we're looking at pedigrees, if you did any type of additional information. But a genetic disease or disorder, technically is what it's called, is caused by a gene rather than like a pathogen. And we know that these are inherited, which is what you guys looked into. So the rest of the stuff is a couple different disorders. These are the ones IB wants you to know. So PKU is pretty nasty, but go through that. Sickle cell, I swear, is on the IB exam every single year. And it's kind of a cool one because it has codominance mixed in with it. And there's actually some benefit to being a heterozygote because it gives you malaria protection. So you guys should read up on that a little bit as you click through this. And here's just a Punnett square showing this kind of stuff. So you can do Punnett squares for anything. Cystic fibrosis is another one that is often asked about. Huntington's disease is odd because it's an autosomal dominant disorder. We don't see that as often because it's a deadly disorder. Most of those tend to be recessive because they get weeded out of the population, but because Huntington's doesn't take effect till later in life, unfortunately, most people have already had kids by the time they're between ages of 30 and 50, so they have already passed on Huntington's to the next generation. So that one's a sad one. Okay, so who determines the sex of an offspring? Hopefully you guys know this. What was it? Henry the something that beheaded all of his wives because they wouldn't give him boys. Well, whose fault was that? It was his. So if you look at sperm and egg, the female always gives 2 X's. 1 X per egg, and the male has a 50-50 chance of his sperm carrying an X or his sperm carrying a Y. So ultimately it's the male sperm that determines the sex of the offspring, depending on which sperm fertilizes the egg. I'm going through this super fast, so you guys are going to have to come back to it, but I just want to hit the highlights. This is a real picture of sex chromosomes. By now you should recognize that the X is bigger, the Y is smaller. There are traits on both of these that are not linked to sex, and hopefully by now you figured out that the only one you can live without is the Y chromosome. 50% of us in the world are doing it right now as we speak. Okay. Sex-linked genes. This is a little confusing until you just stop and think. So when we're talking about sex-linked traits, these are the rules we have to follow. Fathers pass sex-linked alleles to all of their daughters, but not to their sons. So if we're talking about a trait that's found on the X chromosome, and we're talking about how it gets passed to daughters only, based on this diagram, you can see why that makes sense. If the dad passes on the Y, then he's having a boy. So any trait that's on the X chromosome would not be passed on to his sons. Now for moms only carry X's, so they can pass it on to daughters and to sons. But the thing you have to be leery of is if mom's a heterozygote, one of her X's might be healthy, like maybe this is the healthy one, and then the other X actually might have the disease, so it still depends on which X the kid gets. Color blindness is a classic example of a sex-linked disorder. So more rules about sex-linked genes is if it's due to a recessive allele, that's super, super clear or super important, then the female can only get it if she gets 2 affected X's. In other words, if she's homozygous recessive for the X allele. So for example, if she got a colorblind X from her mom and a colorblind X from her dad, then she would be colorblind. Now for men, that is not true. Men only get 1 shot. So because men only have 1 loci, aka location on a chromosome where this gene is located, because men only have 1 X, whatever they get on the X is what they get. So if it's a sex-linked recessive disorder, it's much more common in males. For example, color blindness is much more common in males because they only need 1 affected X. Females can get it, like we just stated, but it is just more rare. So they can get it, they just have to get 2 copies of it instead of 1. All right, I'm skipping way ahead. Hemophilia is another classic example of a sex-linked disorder. You guys can go through all of that. Pedigrees. Okay, pedigrees, the best thing you can do is just practice. So I will probably send home maybe a pedigree at some point where you have to investigate the different types of inheritance. But honestly, the best thing to do is just to practice. It's literally a puzzle for my little nerds out there. You guys will love these. I look for a few common things. For example, if I see female carriers only, that tells me that there's probably some sort of sex linkage. If I see a carrier, let's go back to this slide. If I see a carrier, and they don't show that on here, but if I see a carrier, that means that often the shape is like half filled in or there's a dot. That just means that they do not exhibit the trait, but they carry the allele. So they are able to pass it on to their offspring, but they might not ever know that it's actually in their DNA because they don't express any of those traits. So that's true for recessive. We can see recessive sex-linked or recessive autosomal. You can see carriers. There aren't any shown on this particular diagram, but you'll see some that have some. If you see it skipping generations, that's often a clue it's recessive. If you see strong male inheritance, that might mean it's sex-linked, but like I said, those are basically just going to require some practice. I think that's about it for this PowerPoint. The rest of it is pretty self-explanatory, just practicing with pedigrees, and hopefully this has been helpful. Post any questions you guys have in discussions, and let me know if you guys are watching these videos. If you are, I'll keep making them. If you're not, I won't bother. Bye.